Project Management for the Masses podcast, episode 36. Project Managers, Start Writing with Jeff Goins.
Project managers, have you ever felt like you should get that promotion or a better job? Start a business, write that book. Have you ever felt you were made for more but didn't know where to start?
Welcome to the PM for the Masses podcast with your host, Caesar Abaid.
Learn from the experts, think outside the box, have a voice, network, and be extraordinary.
PM for the Masses podcast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Project Management for the Masses podcast. My name is Caesar Abaid, your host, and this show is your weekly reminder that your career matters more than your job, and that your life is a project and you are the manager. Whether you work for a company or for yourself, your job stability is really just your ability to land your next gig. So, join me in practicing intentional, planned, and value-adding relevance, starting right now. My friends, as you know, I have been toying around with the idea of writing a book. And if you really have been following me, you might remember that I even kind of hinted at this, I don't know, over a year ago before I even launched the podcast on my blog. And I've been toying around with this idea for a while. And I have to admit, it's been hard. It's been a bit difficult. I could give you all sorts of excuses, just had a baby and, now I have 3 kids and a job and the podcast. But you know what? Every book author has all sorts of things going on in their lives and they still do it. So I'm not going to use those as excuses. It turns out, for me at least, producing the podcast, for example, comes to me a lot more easily. It's easier for me than writing. Even though I can write well, but I don't know. I just find that doing the podcast is I don't know if it's more fun or it's just come easy to me. And it's kind of weird. It's counterintuitive because really, to produce this show, I need to write. I need to write a blog post every week. There is the show notes, and then I need to record. I need to plan the interview. It's a lot of work, But for some reason, I'm able to crank these out every week. But to sit down and write a blog post, I find it hard, especially lately. So, but at the same time, if you've been listening to the show, you understand the importance of writing and what it can do for a career of a project manager. I mean, almost every single project manager, author or speaker that I've had as a guest on the show, they all talked about the fact that it all started with a book, or with a blog that they wrote. So I think it's important, so I decided to take it seriously this year. I made it one of my goals to write my first book. I don't know that I'll be able to write and publish and have it all done by the end of this year, but at least I like to have a big, substantial portion of this project completed. So in order to do that, I decided to enlist some help. So to help me get started here, I invited one of the best bloggers out there who talk about the art and craft of writing, Mr. Jeff Goins. So how about we get started?
Special guest coming up next. PMforthemasses.com. PMforthemasses.com.
Jeff Goins was born and raised outside of Chicago and graduated from Illinois College. An author, speaker, and writing coach, Jeff writes and podcasts about writing and has been featured on some of the largest blogs in the world, including Copyblogger, ProBlogger, MichaelHyatt.com, Reject Apathy, Right to Done, and Relevant Magazine. And Jeff is on the line with me today from his home in Franklin, Tennessee. Hello, Jeff. How are you?
I'm doing great, Cesar. How are you?
I am good. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're super busy and you're involved in all sorts of projects, and it's an honor to have you on the show.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Now, Jeff, you are a writer. And you act like one. Little inside joke there.
I try to.
You tried to. Yeah, and this is something that I talk about on the podcast a lot, because a lot of my guests who are accomplished in the field of project management and other fields as well, a lot of them talk about the fact that it all started with a blog or a book that they wrote. And so much so that it kind of inspired me and other people who listen to the show to think about writing. So, and we're going to talk about writing a little bit. But before we get there, I think it'd be a good opportunity here right at the get-go to talk about your new podcast, which is called Portfolio Life. Can you talk to us about that a little bit? What's that all about?
Sure. Well, thanks for mentioning it. Yeah, it's basically this idea that you are more than one thing, and you, like any human being, have more than one task on your daily to-do list. And yet, when we talk about what we do, we tend to describe it as like, one thing. Like, I'm a writer, therefore I write. But the truth is, I'm a writer, therefore I have, I'm self-employed, therefore I have a business to manage, and I have a blog to run, and I negotiate contracts with publishers, and have an audience to manage and maintain. I have a lot of different hats that I wear, and so it's much more appropriate to say I am a portfolio manager. I have a portfolio of activities, of things that I am in charge of, that have to all be running smoothly in order for me to be doing my job as a writer, to be doing it well. And so the idea of the podcast is, what if we approached our life's work more as a portfolio and less as a singular task? I think that's a more honest way to approach it. And I think for some people, especially creative-minded people, it is a little bit freeing and liberating to think of what you do, to think of your work not as one sole activity, but as a few activities that you can work together. There's some sort of thread tying everything together in a way that is personally fulfilling and also fruitful.
Makes a lot of sense. And it's I listened to your first two episodes, by the way. The second one, I listened to it this morning. You talked to Seth Godin, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
That was a great conversation you had with him there. And one thing that Seth and you talked about is the fact that we live now in an information age, and we are all knowledge workers. Mm-hmm. Project managers, I often talk about this on the show. They start in a technical position as a coder or somebody in construction, or somebody who learns a skill that is technical, and then they get promoted to this position now where they have to lead a project, and that involves communicating and leading people and compelling people to see a big picture. And as I was reading to your conversation with Seth, I couldn't help but think about the fact that project managers are already in this kind of a knowledge worker type of mindset, because it's almost like an art to lead these people and not so much of a technical skill. So can you maybe describe to us how you see that divide between in the industrial age, where we learn how to make gadgets and in an assembly line type of way, and now the world that we live in, where knowing about the gadget is perhaps more important than the gadget itself?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Seth made a great point about that. And the term knowledge worker, I think was coined by Peter Drucker back in like the late 80s. And I've been reading a lot of like business literature from that time. Another book that I'm reading, really, that I base the podcast name off of, Portfolio Life, is a book called The Age of Unreason by Charles Handy. And he and Drucker and a number of others basically talk about the future as if it's this thing that's going to happen way off in the distance. And it's interesting because we're living this future now. But they talk about this idea that what you know is more important than what you can do. And Seth mentioned that in my interview with him. And I think the bottom line is, when you are in a society and a culture that is working towards greater and greater efficiency, which was basically the story of the 20th century, we were trying to build things that made human beings less essential, seemingly. Like the assembly line basically took the humanity out of the work that you were doing in a lot of good ways. I know that we tend to sort of criticize factories and that whole deal, but we can't ignore how much the world has been improved through a lot of inefficient processes being made extremely efficient. But what happened, in that process is we basically took people out of the equation so that these machines could build these things that, human hands used to only be able to build. And so when you pulled the human out of that process, I think the question is, so what role does a human being have in business, in work, in the first place? Is it to be a part of an assembly line, or to be, one more set of hands, putting a plate of glass on an iPhone? Or is it something else? And I think this idea of a knowledge worker is the reality is human beings are human beings because of their brains, because of their minds, because they were, they're the only creatures that were able to build those machines to make that process more efficient in the first place. And so I think we're living in a really exciting age when in many ways we're coming back to working the humanity back into the work. Seth talked about that just kind of broadly, that the things that we are attracted to in society now are the things that look like art, he said, and I would argue that they're the things that look the most human. I don't choose a restaurant for a date night with my wife because it's the fastest, best tasting meal necessarily, the most efficient process. I choose it because it feels good, and there are these little things that they do along the way that make it feel authentic, whatever that means. And I think that's especially true in the work that we do, whether you're working with a bunch of developers on a website that you're building, making sure the designer is talking, to the coder, which is, talking to the guy who's shelling out the big budget for the project that the client wants. So whether it's that, or you're a writer or a podcaster, or doing street performances, I think we're finding some really interesting ways to inject our humanity back into the work that we are doing. And it just so happens that I think society is those are the things that we crave most.
Mm-hmm. So would you say perhaps that as we go through a constant state of change now with technology and the way people communicate, maybe art and the human connection are constants in this process that we can hang on to?
Yeah, I mean, we'll always be human.
Right.
I am always willing to pay somebody to do something for me that I don't want to take the time to do on my own. And I'll even amend that to say I'll always pay somebody to use a tool better than I can. So I think that, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, we thought that, man, if we just created enough tools that this could, that this would be the future. I mean, you even saw I guess 50, 60 years ago, you sort of saw the prophecies of what a technology-driven world could look like. I mean, the movie Terminator is a great example of that. One day the robots are going to take over. I don't think that's true, because not just from the artificial intelligence has to have some real intelligence behind it standpoint, but from the greater standpoint that economically, we will always value things that make us feel more human, that connect us to each other. And a tool can't do that. A tool is arbitrary. It's just something that you use for whatever means you have. And I have lots of tools and I have lots of access to technology, and I don't have time or necessarily a desire always to figure it out. And I'm always valuing the expertise that somebody has over that tool or over that domain, so that they can come in and help me understand, how do I interact with this thing? So just because a tool exists doesn't mean that the humanity is taken out of it. In some places and in some ways, it kind of requires that the human element, the art element, as you said, kind of rise to the top. And so I think that's important to remember, that as more technology gets created, as more tools are in the marketplace, that's not competing with human beings. In some ways, it is sort of creating new jobs and new opportunities for people to come in and say, okay, I know more about this tool than anybody else. I think about something like a tool that I use, Scrivener. As a writer, I use a word processor called Scrivener, which is this like super amazing, robust tool for writing book manuscripts. And it is very complicated, and I don't understand all that it can do, which is why I'm glad to know somebody like Joe, the Scrivener coach at scrivenercoach.com, who basically has built a business on helping people figure out how to use this tool. So here's a great example where somebody has seen an opportunity in the marketplace. Here's a tool that people are using to make their lives easier, and they need some help with it. And I think those opportunities are abundant.
Awesome. Now, with that as a background, let's talk a little bit about writing.
Sure.
I've had a number of guests on the show who are really successful in our industry of project management and other industries as well. And I typically ask, the same set of questions of these folks. And one of them has to do with what were the first steps that they've taken to be where they are today. And almost all of them, without exception, will trace their success back to either their book or their blog. So what is it about writing that even with all the technology that we have television, we have podcasts and radio and the internet, what is it about writing that it's still so powerful today?
Well, I think there are a few things about writing that I find powerful, and why I gravitate to it towards it as both a reader and as a content creator. First of all, it's old, right? I mean, we've been writing since the dawn of time, even hieroglyphics and writing on cave walls and whatnot. We've been using pictures and words to evoke emotion and tell stories and connect with other human beings for a long, long time. And even the written word, in our culture, writing and publishing books and, sharing these ideas with the world. I mean, that's a technology that's been around for at least 500 years, since the invention of the printing press. That's a pretty reliable way to get your ideas out there. And so if you care about spreading ideas like I do, it's safe to say that you're going to want to get into the game of writing in some way, because we've been doing it for a long, long time, and we're going to continue to do it for a long, long time. I would say the second reason for it is that it doesn't require much. It's simple. It doesn't require a lot of technology. Sure, you can have a MacBook and you can have fancy programs, but you can literally write with a pencil and a piece of paper. Writing is a very easy way to record portable ideas. I can write something down on a piece of paper, and then that idea is now captured, and now I can publish that in a blog post, or I can hand that note to my wife, or I can pass it around to 10 friends. It easily spreads because I've written it down. And I think, to this day, that's why most of us got up this morning and checked our email and read a bunch of text. And some of those were very important pieces of text, and some of them were not so important. But a lot of us every day are exchanging ideas through the written medium. And my first job out of college was as a copywriter for a nonprofit. My boss told me, he said, if you can write and write well, you will always be hireable. You will always have a job. Not to say that we're always looking to, pay writers really, really well, but if you can write and if you can communicate your ideas well, you're going to use that skill in a lot of different applications. And I found that to be true.
How did you start writing, outside of, let's say, a place of employment and on your own, like on a blog, for example? What made you start, and how did you start?
Well, there are a lot of parts to that story. I mean, the simplest answer is I've always written, but that's not too fun of an interview answer. The second part of it is I made the decision to be a writer when I had a conversation with a friend, and he asked me what my dream was. And I'd always been kind of writing on the side, although I never considered myself a writer and never thought that I would do this vocationally someday, just because it didn't seem promising or realistic or even possible. And so it was always sort of a side hobby. And then my friend asked me what my dream was, and I said, yeah, I guess it's to be a writer. And he said, Jeff, you don't have to want to be a writer. You are a writer. You just need to write. And so what happened after that conversation was I decided to entertain this idea that maybe I am this thing that I already want to be. I just need to act like it, as you mentioned. And so I did. I started writing, and I started writing more than I'd ever written before. I'd always kind of, written on the side, but I'd never taken it really seriously, which is to say that like every third Saturday of the month, I would open my laptop and write for maybe an hour or two as I felt inspired, and if the wind were blowing in just the right direction and it was, just the right temperature outside. And when I didn't feel inspired, I wouldn't write. It was just sort of this whimsical thing that I did whenever I fancied doing it. And after that conversation, I decided, what if I acted like a professional writer, like somebody who got up every day and just started writing? Because that's what a writer does, regardless of whether or not people like it or I get paid for it or not. I'm just going to start essentially pretending to be a pro and see what happens. And what's funny about pretending to be a pro is to the outside onlooker, they don't necessarily know that you're pretending. And if your work is good or good enough for them, then people see that you're acting like a pro and they start treating you like a pro. And that's kind of what happened to me. I launched a blog and started sharing some of my thoughts on that blog, and grew an audience that way that eventually allowed me to start publishing books and quit my job and do a bunch of fun stuff after that.
Mm-hmm. You talked about if you about use the words if you are good at writing. Is this something you're born with, or can you work on this craft and become a good writer?
Oh, I don't think you're born with it. I think that's a myth. I think that there's some really interesting studies that have come out over the past 10, 15 years about where excellence comes from. And most researchers agree that even if you were born with some sort of innate talent in something, it's virtually impossible. And it's definitely unheard of that somebody would get to world-class excellence without having lots and lots of practice. And so regardless of your ability, writing is something that anybody can do and everybody can do better. And so a lot of times I get this question, people email me and say, I'm not sure if I'm a good writer, or, is this any good? This is sort of the fear that we have. I met with my editor today about my next book, and what I wanted to ask him as he read this thing that, in many ways feels like my life's work, I wanted to ask him, is it any good? Did you like it? And those are really bad questions to answer, because that in some ways doesn't really matter what he thinks is good or bad. Some people think Stephen King is really, really good, and some people think he's bad, and some people love Ernest Hemingway or Anne Lamott, and other people hate those people, hate those writers. So what does it mean to be a good writer? I think that's less important, especially for the sake of our conversation. And it's better to say, is this effective? Does this accomplish what I set out, for it to accomplish? Does it connect with the reader, my intended reader, in the way that I wanted it to, or does it not? And that's a much more productive question than, is it any good? Because I'm sure you're going to find somebody who loves it and hates it. That's not the question. The question is, does it do what I want it to do? And that's a pretty good place to start when you're, beginning writing or wanting to get better, is to do what my friend Marion Roach Smith calls writing with intent. Forget about, flowery prose and making pretty words. That's sort of secondary. What's primary is, if you have a message, how do you communicate it effectively? And if you can sort of, start with that as your baseline, writing with intent to connect with somebody and change somebody in some way, that's a metric that you can measure, evaluate, and improve upon.
Very good. Now I have an idea for a couple of books, and they're outlined, and I just know I need to just kind of sit down and write, and that's a problem that I have. And the reason why I have this podcast is because I started as a blogger, and I didn't feel that passion to write on a frequent basis, on a regular basis. And then I found podcasting, and I thought that to be more fun in my case. But let's say there's somebody listening to the show right now who has a job in corporate America, a 9 to 5, in a cubicle, and they never thought about writing or the benefits of writing. What do you say to those listening? Do you encourage them to start, or is it not for everybody?
For writing?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would never tell somebody to do something that they don't want to do. Going back to the advice that I received from my first boss, that if you can write, you'll always be hireable. You'll always have a job in some respect. You don't have to write if you don't want to. And yet I think ignoring this skill, it would be an oversight. I think at least having some basic writing skills until we start, recording videos and sending those back and forth over email all the time, as a major way of communicating. I think it's a really important skill that in our lifetime we will probably always need, and until that it's easy and cheap to do hologram conversations or something. I think it's valuable, and I think it's short-sighted to overlook the importance of being able to express and communicate your ideas well through written format. Because, like I said, it's very simple, it's cheap, it's low bandwidth. It's great when you can do a video call with somebody, but that's not always possible. Internet connections aren't always great. But writing a little piece of text and sending it over email, or texting it, or actually sending a physical letter, these are still really important ways to share and spread ideas. And so, no, you don't have to be a writer, but that's very different from whether or not you should at least tackle the skill of writing, because it is something that most of us spend part of our days doing, if only answering emails or writing up a project proposal for that construction project you're about to work on, or something else. I mean, there are many, many opportunities to use written communication to express ourselves well. And then there's all that other, sort of byproduct that happens when you write more. You become more analytical and you think about things better, and it helps you grow and think through things in a way that you might not have done before. I like what Flannery O'Connor says. I don't know what I think about something until I read what I say. And I think that's true for a lot of writers, even those who don't consider themselves writers. When you write something down, you kind of unpack the way that you think about something, and it helps you understand yourself better.
Yeah, I can relate to this as well, because I'm an immigrant. I had to learn English when I was 19, 20 years old, mm-hmm. and I learned how to write well before I learned how to speak. and I think it wasn't intentional. It's just that the classes I took at junior college were creative writing and composition, things like that, and I think as an immigrant that really opened doors for me. A lot, because I could write a cover letter and I could communicate by email well. And it wasn't until I met someone in person that they could tell that, I had an accent and things like that. So yeah, I totally agree with you that it really opens doors for you if you can write well. And,
mm-hmm. I mean, if you can't, it can sort of it can kill a career. It can kill an opportunity before it even has an opportunity to succeed. If I'm getting an email or a note from somebody and they're just not expressing themselves well, or it's obvious that you don't have to be an amazing writer, but if you're really bad, that shows. And that just kind of demonstrates a lack of excellence that you might be able to overcome. If we have an opportunity to sit down and you can kind of woo me with your ability to speak and persuade, but you might not ever have that opportunity. If you wrote a cover letter that just wasn't very good, you might not ever have the opportunity to interview. And that is the reality of the world that we live in right now. And so maybe it's not enough to be just a great writer, or to have an ability to write really well, but it is a really important first step to engaging in any kind of business relationship or opportunity.
Hmm. Now, how can one create a habit of writing every day? And this is something it's a question I have myself, because I really would like to create that habit, and I've tried before. Sit down and write for 15 minutes every day, and even put on like a task on my to-do list, to remind me every day to do it. I use that what is it, the OneNote app? Again, I think it's called. It buzzes on my desktop, once a day. Hey, you need to write, and I learned to ignore it. So, what do you have any tips for those who are trying to create a habit of writing?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's the same way you create any habit, and the challenge to this is you say, well, here's how you do it, and there's nothing fancy about it. Sit down, write a little bit every day, and people go, yeah, I tried that. But if we apply this same sort of rubric in another field, like, well, how do I get into shape? Well, you need to eat less and exercise more, and maybe you kind of go into that a little bit more, and so you need to understand your body type and peak performance and how to maximize calorie loss and all that. But the bottom line is everybody knows how to do the things that they know that they need to do. It's just a question of how do I actually motivate myself to do it? And so there's two answers to that question, I think. First is what you already talked about, Cesar, which is you have to do it. You have to get on with it. And I think the best way to do that is to just have a very simple, easy goal that you can attain on a daily basis. You can measure and build upon. Like I'm gonna write something every day, or I'm gonna write for 10 minutes, or I'm gonna write 25 words, and then tomorrow I'm gonna write 26. There's some basic benchmark upon which you can build to create momentum. I think that's really important. That's the first part. The second part, and this addresses the motivation side, and is the reason why I don't work out even when I know I should at times, is I think that in order to do anything, to create any habit, the pain of not doing that thing, you have to reach a tipping point. And the tipping point is when the pain of not doing that thing that you should do becomes greater than the discomfort of doing it. When the pain of not doing it becomes greater than the discomfort of doing it, that's when you're actually going to create the habit. That's when you're going to do it. When, I have a friend, Ben Dempsey, who, got in a great shape, lost something like 200 pounds. There was just this moment where, he kind of tried these different diets and tried to work out, and then it would fail, and then he'd come back to it. There was this moment for him when he took his kids to Six Flags and tried to get sit in a roller coaster, and he couldn't fit in the seat, and he was embarrassed, he was ashamed, he was frustrated, and he'd had experiences like that before. That wasn't the tipping point. The tipping point was when he said, you know what, I've been blaming other people, I've been blaming the ride, I've been blaming the parks. This is my issue, and I have to own this. And when he decided to own that and say, if I want this to change, I can't expect the world to change around me. I need to change. And that was the moment where everything, changed for him. And I think the same thing is true with writing, with creating any kind of habit. That's what happened with me. Is I wanted to be a writer. I talked about being a writer. I sort of played around with the idea, but I never really did it seriously. And there was this shift where I said, you know what, I'm tired of thinking about someday being a writer. I'm going to start being a writer now. And that was less uncomfortable than just playing around and pretending that maybe someday I might be this thing. It was harder to stay stuck than it was to get up every day and write a little bit.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like brushing your teeth, and when you don't, you just feel bad, and then you have to do it.
That's right. Yeah, and stuff starts growing on them, which is a good cue that it's time to pull out the toothbrush.
Very good. Now, as I mentioned here, a lot of the guests on the show talked about writing a book and how that opened doors and got them, speaking gigs and jobs and contracts but at this, so I'm thinking of the audience right now who might be thinking maybe I should write a book so I can get more opportunities. Is that the wrong motivation to write?
I think the best motivation is to write because you can't not do it. I mean, I think we all know that intrinsic motivation is better than extrinsic motivation in terms of longevity. Long-term sustainability with a career. It's better to write. It's better to write for the right reasons, which is because you find it rewarding and gratifying. And yeah, some really cool things might happen as a result of that. Does that mean it's wrong to start with mixed motives? I sure hope not, because that would mean probably most of the things that I have pursued in my life, I shouldn't have ever started because I didn't have completely pure motives when I began. I don't think it's wrong to pursue writing because, you think of it as, a lucrative opportunity. But I do think when you're in the thick of it, when you're contracted to write a 50,000 word manuscript for a publisher, or you're on the 110th day of blogging in a row, you will reach these moments where the far off and distant reward of, someday I'll get this if I stick with this, is not enough to help you endure through, the daily grind. And if you want to be serious about any craft, I think in some ways doing it has to be its own reward. It has to be rewarding in some sense. And that's, not always easy, and I'm not sure it's for everybody. But I think there has to be some sort of short-term payoff where you go, even if it's just you're writing your life story and you're going to publish a book and everybody's going to love it and buy it, you're going to make $1 million. There's got to be something therapeutic and helpful in the writing process in order for you to feel like this is time well spent right now.
Mm-hmm. Takes us back full circle to the humanity and the art that we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation here, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's okay to say, I write, but I'm not a writer. It's not my sole thing. I do think that if you write, in some respects you are a writer, but it's helpful to understand what role does this craft serve in my career? Is it my sole pursuit, or is it something that I do to, achieve this certain end? But regardless, when you're in the midst of a big project, I think you have to find ways to love what you're doing while you're doing. Otherwise, if you're like me, you're just going to quit and go find something that you like doing a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Now, would you be able to give us maybe a 30,000-foot view of your book writing process? Is it related to your blog? Is this something you write separately, or you use some of the blog posts that you've written and collect them into a book? How does writing a book look like from your perspective?
It's hard to write a book and seriously maintain a blog at the same time. I try to do it, but it is a challenge because book writing, for me, you have to dive deep into the content, I think. And so that first hour of working on a book is for me is often worthless. But then once I get to the 2 or 3 hour mark, I get really deep into the work that I'm doing, and I don't want to quit. And I'm just hyper focused, and so there's this intensity that happens only with concentrated bursts of effort, and that's no good if you've got a half an hour phone call every 90 minutes or something. Or you've got a new blog post to write every day, disrupting that rhythm. So the challenge in writing a book, I think, is carving out the time to have those deep dives into the work. And then once you're in there, what do you actually do? And when I'm in there, I'm basically going through a process of getting all the junk out first. I wish I could get to the best work, right out the gates, but I have to write a lot of crap before I can get to, not so crappy work. So the first draft for me is just about getting words on paper. The second draft is about building the structure. The next draft is kind of, making it into a decent manuscript that I, wouldn't be embarrassed to show somebody. Then, you get some help editing, and finally, you polish it up and make sure it's actually pretty, that you're using the right words and paying attention to the stories and how, sentence structure and all of that works. And so all that to say, it's a pretty iterative process. And at the initial level of just getting words on paper, I will repurpose content if it makes sense. I will just, wherever I can find words and throw them on the paper. That's what I'm trying to do in that initial stage, is just get to my word count, just get ideas on paper. They can be very, very ugly, and they often are. It's just about capturing all that content. And then once I have that, I'm in a good spot because now I can just edit and whittle it down to what it needs to be. But for me, the hardest part is just getting those words on paper, and that requires time, focus, and a little bit of repurposing of content if it makes sense. But usually when I'm writing a book, most of it is original stuff. And even if it's from a blog, I have to work it in a way that that it makes sense within the book, because a series of blog posts don't usually flow like a 200-page book might. And so even if you're repurposing content, you're going to reshape it a lot.
Very cool. Now, for those thinking about starting writing in maybe a blog, maybe a book, or maybe just writing for a journal, what is the first step that you recommend to those listening?
To starting a blog?
To start writing.
Start writing.
Yeah. Well, let's say a blog and then a book.
For whatever reason, this one step, this one idea, has been incredibly powerful, both in my life and in the lives of lots of people. I meet somebody every day online or in real life that tells me this, that when you call yourself a writer, even if that's you're never going to be a novelist and you're never going to, write books or do any of that stuff, but you kind of want to write and you're not quite sure, what to do with that desire or interest. For whatever reason, the power of this affirmation of saying, I am a writer, or writing it down, or just, believing it. I think there's something really important about some sort of physical action. Writing it down is what I did. Audibly saying it out loud so you can hear it, maybe somebody else can hear it, saying, I am a writer. For whatever reason, that is really, really powerful. And I know it sounds, to some people, to me especially, who's a little bit skeptical, sounds kind of hokey. And it is hokey, but it's also really powerful, and it works. And the reason that it works, I think, is because activity always follows identity. That what you do in some way flows from who you are and your deepest beliefs about who you think you are. And so if you can sort of fake yourself, even if you don't fully believe it, but you can sort of say, okay, I'm a writer, we'll see about this, and then start writing from that place of affirmation, of saying yes to the possibility that you might be a writer, this thing that you hope to be. That is just really powerful. And I all the stuff that you've heard before, well, just start writing and find a way to put your work out there and have people see it. Yeah, that's all true. But I think it begins a step before you put pencil to paper, fingers to keyboard, is with this idea of calling yourself a writer. And then once you do that, you start practicing. And then the step after that is you practice in public. You share it with people who are going to give you feedback and encouragement and and call you out when you need to be called out.
Fantastic. Now, Jeff, if people want to learn more about you, and where should they go? And if you have any resources that you can share with my audience, where should they get them? Well,
the best place to get a lot of free stuff from me is to go to my blog at goinswriter.com. That's like coins, but with a G, G-O-I-N-S, writer.com. And you go there and sign up for my free newsletter. And there are at least 3 bonuses that you get, including a free ebook and some other resources about building an online audience, all of which you get free as soon as you sign up for the newsletter. That's the best place to go.
And it's all great information, and it's really free. There's no there's no pitch at all. Very cool. So, Jeff, thank you so much for your time, and I will add all the links that we talked about here, even some of the authors and books that you mentioned, on the show notes for this episode, which the listener can find at pmforthemasses.com/36. Jeff, thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you on Twitter.
Thank you, Cesar. It's my pleasure.
You are listening to the PM for the Masses podcast.
All right. I don't know about you, but I found that really inspiring. Jeff has a lot of information. You can tell he's been doing this for a while. And if you go to his website and you sign up for the mailing list, you're going to get a lot of goodies as we talked about there. So I really recommend you go to the website. And just one correction there. I mentioned during my conversation with Jeff that I use an application for journaling, and I mentioned the name OneNote, and turns out the name of the application is Day One, that should tell you, how often I've been using it. Not very often at all. And Day One is a journaling application that it syncs with your. I think it's. I don't know if it's Windows. I use it on the Mac, but it syncs with your iPad and your iPhone, so you can actually write a journal and synchronize across all devices. And it has some neat features, like you can add a picture, you can add a location, you can set a reminder to remind you to write every day. And I started making a habit of writing for 10 minutes every day, and writing itself is all right. This is not a blog post. It's just for me to unload my brain and my thoughts into paper, or virtual paper, or electronic paper. But what is for me, at least, what was really fascinating is not the actual act of writing, but give it a few months and you go back and you read some of the things that were on your mind back then. It's truly fascinating. I'd forgotten, a lot of those things. So, for example, I started blogging, I started journaling when I was in Brazil last year for a World Youth Day, and I remember I was sitting in a room with 4 other guys, and we were all pilgrims, and we were sharing this room, sleeping on the floor. And I got up early for some reason, and I took out the iPad and started typing just my thoughts, what was on my mind. And I just read that again, a couple of weeks ago, over a year later, and man, I've forgotten that I had those thoughts, then. So it's really important for us to externalize, the things that are on our minds. And journaling is a great way to not only start doing that, but also getting you in the habit of writing. So I'm making a pledge here again to go back to journaling, and starting today. And if you want to do that as well, let me know. Go to pmforthemasses.com/36, which is the episode notes for today's show. Leave a comment there. And the other thing you can do, you can go to the Google Plus community. There's a lot of bloggers in that community for some reason, and we're always talking about blogging and different things. So, and you can find that at pmforthemasses.com/Google. And there's a lot to be learned from each other, and writing is a journey as well. So it's good to have company. So if you like to connect with other bloggers and other people who are making an effort at writing more, go and join the Google Plus community there. And the other thing is, it really helps that we're all in the same niche. We're all project managers. We're all talking about these similar topics. So it's an interesting thing to connect with like-minded individuals in our industry. And I hope to see you there. And again, just as a reminder, all the links that Jeff and I talked about here today can be found at the show notes for today's episode at pmforthemasses.com/36. That's number 36 for episode 36. So that's it for the show today. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jeff Goins, and that it has inspired you to start putting down some thoughts on paper or onto your keyboard. So start writing, and I will see you next week. And until then, remember that life is a project, and you, my friend, are the manager. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you for listening to the PM for the Masses podcast.
Tune in next week for more great ideas on how to manage your projects better and truly stand out in your industry.
pmforthemasses.com